You ate an identical breakfast on consecutive mornings and your body answered each time with a completely different number. Same eggs, same toast. The portion, the hour, the kitchen clock, all of it matched. On the first morning, the little sensor under your skin drew a gentle hill that rose and settled before you had finished your coffee. On the next, that same plate drew a mountain, climbing higher and refusing to come down for hours. That little sensor has a name, a continuous glucose monitor, a CGM for short, and most people who wear one believe it is grading their food. Nothing on the plate had changed. The sensor kept working perfectly, and it reported honestly on both mornings. It measured your blood correctly each time. What changed was the body the food walked into. How much you slept the night before bent that number. Whether you moved your legs after eating bent it again. The hour on the clock bent it. The worry you carried into the kitchen bent it. And underneath all of that sits a stranger fact, one almost nobody who wears these sensors has ever been told. The monitor is measuring something far more complex than what you swallowed. It is measuring how your body is handling glucose right now, through every system that determines whether that glucose enters a cell, stays in the blood, or gets converted to fat. That is the thing to hold on to. The number is a report on the machinery, and the machinery has 6 moving parts. You may already know by other names. But before the 6 there is the sensor itself, and the sensor is hiding a delay nobody mentions when they hand it to you. So what is the sensor really touching? Start with it, because the answer is not where you would guess. The little filament that slips under your skin comes to rest short of any blood vessel, in the thin, watery space between your cells, a place with a name worth learning, the interstitial fluid. The blood runs deeper, sealed inside the vessels. The sensor floats in the puddle that bathes the cells, one layer removed from the river. Everything it will ever tell you comes from that puddle, never straight from the stream. On the tip of that filament is a coating of an enzyme, a biological tool shaped to seize one particular molecule and ignore all the rest. This one seizes glucose. When a glucose molecule settles onto it, the enzyme tears it apart, and that tearing shakes loose a tiny trickle of electrons. Electrons in motion are nothing other than electrical current. The more glucose landing each second, the larger the trickle of current the reaction gives off. So the device on your arm is at heart a very small and very patient electrical meter, reading the strength of a current and converting that strength into the figure glowing on the screen. Twice as much glucose in the fluid, roughly twice the current, roughly twice the reading. The enzyme has a name you can say once and set aside, because you will meet it nowhere else in your day. Glucose oxidase. Picture a glucose detector soldered to a battery sitting quietly in the fluid around your cells, counting. Now this counting is genuinely electrical, not a figure of speech. The electrons shaken loose by the reaction are collected by a fine wire, the electrode held at a set voltage, and the current that flows along that wire is measured directly, moment by moment. A larger current means more glucose reacted in that instant, which means more glucose sitting in the fluid. This is why the sensor must be calibrated and why it can drift. A reaction that runs a little hot or a little cold, an electrode that ages over its week under your skin, and the current shifts a shade even when the glucose has not. The number you trust is the far end of a small chain of physical translations, from sugar to reaction to electrons to current to a figure on glass, and every link in that chain has its own tolerances. And here is the first thing the number never admits to you. Look at where that glucose came from. It seeped out of the blood, pushed across the wall of the smallest vessels, the capillaries, and drifted into the space where the sensor waits. That seepage takes time. It is a slow migration through living tissue, not an instant readout. And depending on how fast your levels are moving, the glucose resting on the sensor left the blood somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes earlier, a gap Basu and colleagues quantified in the journal Diabetes Technology and Therapeutics. The figure on your screen is your blood sugar from a quarter of an hour ago, a letter that departed the river and has only just been delivered to the puddle. When your glucose holds steady, this hardly matters because a quarter hour ago and now look nearly identical. But during a sharp climb or a sharp fall, the two drift far apart. A finger prick reading, taken straight from a drop of blood, will disagree with the sensor precisely when your sugar is moving fastest, because the finger reads the river and the sensor reads the puddle the river has not yet filled. The disagreement is not even symmetric. On the way up, the puddle lags behind the rising river and the sensor reads low. On the way back down, the puddle empties slower than the river drains and the sensor reads high, so the very same fast movement fools the screen in opposite directions depending on which way your sugar is heading. The screen is always showing you a moment that has already passed. Hold that gap in mind. It comes back later, and it will change how you read every number you have ever trusted on that screen. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. A device most people treat as a live window onto their blood is really a slightly old letter from a nearby room. It is accurate. It is just never quite now, so the sensor reads a delayed echo of the blood. But what makes the blood rise at all, and what is a spike truly built from once you follow it down into a single cell? Follow the food. The toast and the eggs came apart in your small intestine, and the long chains of starch were snipped down into loose glucose. Dedicated carrier proteins hauled that glucose across the wall of your intestine, molecular ferries built for this one cargo. Some of these ferries spend energy to do it, dragging glucose across the wall by hitching it to sodium and pulling both through together, working even against the current. Others sit as open channels that simply let glucose slide from the crowded gut toward the emptier blood downhill, no effort required. The mix of the two sets how fast the sugar reaches the river, and so it sets how fast the tap runs before any of the doors even hear about it. Across that wall, into the blood, and the level in the river begins to climb. Your pancreas feels the climb within moments, sensing the rising sugar through an internal gauge tuned to glucose, and it answers by releasing insulin, the messenger whose whole job is to tell your cells to open their channels. And then, insulin drifts through the blood and knocks on the wall of a muscle cell. Here is the part almost no one pictures correctly. Inside a resting muscle cell, the channels that admit glucose are not standing ready on the surface. They are held back in storage, folded into tiny bubbles deep in the cell's interior, waiting for a summons. When insulin knocks on the outer wall, the opening happens at a distance. It sets off a relay inside the cell, a chain of molecular switches that carries the message inward, each switch flipping the next until the signal reaches those stored bubbles and orders them forward. The bubbles travel up to the surface, merge into the outer wall, and the doors they carried lock open. Only then does glucose that was stranded in the blood pour through into the muscle, where it is either burned for fuel at once or wound up into coils and stored for later. That inward relay, from the knock at the wall to the doors rising through the membrane, is a sequence your body runs millions of times an hour. The scientists who traced it call the switch chain the insulin signaling pathway, and the doors at the end of it, the actual openings glucose passes through, they call the glucose transporter. The switches in that inward chain carry names as well, a lead switch and its lieutenant that the researchers label with initials, the first a lipid switch on the inner wall, the second the enzyme it activates, together the workhorse relay of insulin's whole message. What matters is not the initials but the shape of the thing. A knock outside, a chain of switches within, and doors that rise only at the end of it. Remember those doors. 3 of the 6 moving parts will open these same doors by entirely separate means, and the moment you see that, your morning numbers stop being random. Your liver keeps its own accounts. It draws glucose in without waiting for insulin to knock, through its own channels that stand permanently ajar, and it packs the incoming sugar into storage until its warehouse is crammed to the roof. And once the liver's warehouse is full, the sugar that keeps arriving does not evaporate. The liver begins stitching the excess into fat, building fat molecules out of surplus sugar through a process of quiet manufacture. Keep that overflow in the back of your mind. It will turn out to be the single most important thing the sensor cannot see. A spike, then, is a race between 2 speeds. On one side, glucose is arriving from the gut. On the other, cells are hauling it back out of the blood through all those openings. The height of the spike is nothing more than the distance between those 2 speeds. When sugar floods in faster than the doors can clear it, the level piles up in the river and the sensor draws a mountain. When the doors keep pace with the arrival, the level barely stirs and the sensor draws a hill. Arrival rate against absorption rate. That single race is the entire meaning of the number. Think of a bathtub with the tap running and the drain open at once. The food controls the tap. The doors are the drain. The water level, the number on your screen, is never about the tap alone. Open the drain wide, and the fastest tap barely raises the water. Clog the drain and a trickle from the tap floods the tub. 2 mornings, the same tap, and the level rises differently because the drain was a different size each day, which tells you something the food alone never could. The plate sets only the arrival speed. Everything else, every one of the 6 parts, sets the absorption speed. And the absorption speed is a different creature on every morning of your life. You now understand what the sensor touches and what a spike is built from. The question turns now, away from what the number is, toward why the identical food writes a different number day after day. 6 systems are holding the pen. Which of them can you actually watch move? 5 of them, as it turns out, in real time. Begin with the sleep behind you. After a poor night, your cells turn slow to answer insulin's knock, all through the next day. The messenger pounds on the door and the muscle is sluggish to respond, so glucose loiters in the blood and the spike rides higher off the very same meal. This is no minor wobble. When volunteers were held to roughly 4 hours of sleep across 6 straight nights, their capacity to clear glucose fell by roughly 2/5, as Spiegel's team measured in The Lancet. A single ragged night is gentler than that, yet it leans that way. The taller number after a bad night is your own cells, dulled by too little sleep, dragging their feet at the door. Next comes the clock. Your pancreas does not stand equally alert around the 24 hours. It runs on a daily rhythm, quick and generous with insulin in the morning, slow and stingy by late evening. 1 bowl of oats eaten at 8 in the morning, and again at 8 at night, will draw 2 different curves. The evening one distinctly taller, purely because the machine that answers it has powered down for the day. Poggio Galle and colleagues charted this rhythm in the journal Nutrients, following identical food as it met a shifting metabolism hour by hour. When an evening reading startles you, part of what startled you is your own clock winding down toward sleep. Third, and this one you drive with your own legs. A short walk after eating, even 15 or 20 unhurried minutes, opens the glucose doors without any insulin at all. A contracting muscle does it by 2 roads of its own. The first is a fuel gauge inside the muscle that trips when the cell starts spending energy, sensing the drop not by watching the sugar itself, but by feeling the spent energy pile up as the muscle burns through its fuel, and it answers by calling the stored doors up to the surface to bring in more. The second is the flood of calcium that washes through the muscle every time it contracts. This calcium, the very calcium that drives the contraction itself, which independently helps haul those doors to the wall. Working the muscle throws both switches at once, and the stored doors rise without a single knock from insulin. The walking muscle drinks glucose straight out of the river on its own authority, stacked on top of whatever insulin was already doing, and the spike sags downward. Hanefeld and colleagues recorded exactly this drop in diabetes care. The gentler curve on a morning you strolled after breakfast is that second set of doors, thrown wide by movement alone. Fourth arrives riding your worries. Under stress, your body releases cortisol, and cortisol does 2 hard things to this number in one motion. It commands the liver to pour stored glucose into the blood, lifting the level before a single bite is eaten, and it deadens your cells to insulin, slowing the very doors that would clear the sugar away. Cortisol evolved to fuel a body about to run or fight, and flooding the blood with ready sugar made sense when the threat was a predator. That ancient response fires now over an email or a bad night, pouring glucose into a body that is only sitting at a kitchen table. Glucose shoved in through one hand, while the exits are narrowed by the other. A tense morning carries both a higher starting line and a steeper climb, and not 1 grain of it came from the plate. Fifth is the meal that came before this one. If you ate not long ago, your liver's warehouse is still partly stacked, and a full warehouse has scant room to accept more. The liver stores its sugar as a dense, branching reserve, coiled and packed tight, and there is a ceiling to how much it will hold. Eat again before that reserve has been drawn down, and much of it is still stacked from before, so the incoming glucose finds the shelves already taken. It has nowhere to go but to wait in the blood. And waiting in the blood is precisely what the sensor reads as a taller, longer spike. Last night's dinner is still leaning on this morning's curve, through a warehouse that never fully emptied overnight. Well, look at what has become of the food. 5 separate forces, none of them anywhere on the plate, each one raising or lowering a number you were ready to pin on the eggs. And every single one of the 5 is a system with a life of its own, turning whether or not you ever glance at the screen. 5 variables, 5 hands on the pen. And there is a 6th, quieter than the others, that we will reach shortly because it is the one the sensor cannot show you at all. But first, that delay we set aside. What happens when you start reacting to a screen that runs behind? Remember that the figure is already 15 minutes stale. Now watch what that does to a person staring at it in the kitchen. You see a mountain, and it frightens you, so you rise and start walking to pull it down. A fine instinct. But the walk you have just begun is altering your blood this very minute, and the sensor will not reveal that change for another quarter hour. You are acting on a bulletin from the past while the present goes entirely unrecorded on the glass. It runs stranger than that. The alarm itself, the jolt of worry as the number climbs, releases its own pulse of cortisol, and cortisol nudges your blood glucose upward. That small nudge surfaces on the screen 15 minutes later as a fresh little rise, which you promptly read as the food still spiking you, long after the food has been absorbed and gone. The worry lifted the number, and then the risen number fed the worry. Well, this is the delayed broadcast. You are watching a match on a screen that runs a quarter hour behind the field. The play you are shouting at has already ended, and by the time your reaction reaches the grass, the game has moved on without you. Every decision you make from the screen is a decision about a moment that no longer exists. That delay warps how you read the number. The 6th part warps something deeper. What if the trouble is not timing at all, but something the sensor was never built to see? Here is the 6th system, the silent one. It is not a system you can watch move the way you can watch a walk lower a curve because it hides in the gap between what the sensor reads and what your body actually did with the sugar. The number reports the level of glucose in the blood. It says nothing about where that glucose went, and two opposite destinies can produce the very same reading. Picture a low, flat curve after a meal. It looks like a clean victory. But a flat curve can mean your muscle drank the glucose swiftly and completely, which is genuinely healthy. Or it can mean the glucose rushed into your liver and was spun into fat before it ever had a chance to stack up in the blood, which is the opposite of healthy. The liver, quietly manufacturing fat out of sugar, draws a calm, flat line indistinguishable from clean muscle uptake. A glass of fruit juice loaded with fructose slides past the sensor almost invisibly for exactly this reason. Fructose takes an entirely separate route through the body. Most of it never reaches you muscles to be burned. It is routed straight to the liver, which pulls it in eagerly and, when there is more than the warehouse can shelve, begins assembling it into fat on the spot. The blood glucose barely twitches through all of this because fructose was never the sugar the sensor is built to track, and so the screen stays flat and reassuring while the liver quietly fills with fat. The fat does not stay in the liver either. Much of it is packaged and shipped back out into the blood as circulating fat, a load the sensor has no eye for at all, building silently across years of flat, comforting readings. A low number is not always the good news it appears to be. The sensor cannot tell you which of the two flat lines you are looking at. Now there is a second blindness, deeper than the first. The sensor measures glucose and only glucose. It has no way to measure insulin. Two people can hold the very same steady sugar level while one of them pays for it with 3 to 5 times the insulin of the other, a pancreas straining to force those stubborn openings wide against half-deaf cells. On the screen, both look calm and identical. The price of holding that calm line, the flood of insulin behind it, is entirely invisible. And that flood is the earlier warning. Years before the glucose number ever climbs, the insulin behind it has been rising to hold the line, a strain the sensor was never wired to show. Even one lone number means different things in different bodies. A climb to a given height in you and an identical height in the person beside you are not one event because your muscle mass, your liver's fullness, the sensitivity of your cells, and even the fine calibration of your particular sensor are all your own. How much muscle you carry decides how many transporters there are to open. How lean or fatty your liver has become decides how patiently it accepts the overflow. Years of quiet strain on the system decide how loudly insulin must knock to be heard. The screen shows one figure. Behind it stand a dozen private conditions no two people share, which is why comparing your number to anyone else's is comparing two different machines by the sound of one dial. So the sensor shows you glucose in the blood, delayed by a quarter hour, silent about where the glucose traveled, and silent about the insulin it cost to keep the line calm. which raises the last question, the one that quietly transforms the whole device into something larger than a food tracker. If the number is bent by sleep, by the clock, by movement, by stress, and by the meal before, and blind on top of that to the liver and to the insulin behind the scene, then what on earth is the number actually a report on? It is a report on all of them at once. Consider everything the single figure now carries inside it. It carries the pancreas and its daily clock, setting how much insulin arrives and at what hour. It carries the sensitivity of your cells, setting how readily the cells answer that insulin. It carries the walking pathway, the second set of doors your legs alone can throw open. It carries the sleep behind you, tuning how sharp or how dull those cells will be. It carries the cortisol of your worries, forcing glucose out while pinching the exits closed. And it carries the liver's private threshold, the hidden line past which storage turns to fat. It is less a scoreboard than a single needle on a dashboard, the kind that pulls a dozen hidden conditions into one swing. When the needle moves, no one gauge moved it. The engine temperature, the load, the fuel mix, the hour of the drive all feed that one needle, and reading it as though it reported only the fuel would tell you almost nothing. True, your number is that pooled needle, and 6 engines feed it. 6 systems, and every one of them was leaning its full weight on that number while you were reading it as a verdict on your toast. I spent a stretch of weeks wearing one of these sensors myself, and for the first days I did precisely what nearly everyone does. I treated the glass as a scoreboard for food, praising the meals that scored low and dreading the ones that scored high. Then, almost by accident, I began walking after dinner, and I watched the very same dinner draw a smaller hill night after night. In my own body I understood that I had been misreading the entire instrument. I had been watching my own systems run all along, reading their state as though it were a grade for the food. And once you see it in that light, the sensor stops being a judge and becomes an instrument. It reports how your machinery is running on the particular morning you happen to look, the running state of the systems rather than a grade for the plate. On a rested morning after a walk, the machinery hums and the number falls low, a gentle rise to 120 milligrams per deciliter, which is 6.7 millimoles per liter, settled inside the hour. On a sleepless, tense, motionless morning, the identical food meets a slower machine and climbs past 150 and holds there for hours, and both of those readings are equally true. The sensor was honest on every single morning. You were simply asking it the wrong question and hearing the wrong answer in its reply. You ate the same breakfast 2 mornings in a row. The number was different both times. The food was identical. Your body was different. The sleep the night before changed the receptor sensitivity. The time of day changed the insulin output. The walk after eating added a second glucose channel. The sitting morning lacked. The stress changed the cortisol load that was pushing glucose into the blood while reducing the cell's ability to absorb it. The sensor under your skin measured all of it through a glucose oxidase reaction in the interstitial fluid that reflected your blood glucose from 15 minutes ago. The number was never a food score. It was a systems report. The CGM made them visible. The physics made them legible.